I'm Glenn Campbell. I call myself a demographic philosopher. I'm looking at life and trying to predict the future through the lens of demography, or the study of human populations. Today is Wednesday, March 18th, 2020, and in this episode I want to try to describe what's happening in the world from the widest possible perspective. A wide perspective is why I got into demography to begin with. It's looking at whole human populations, not individuals. Individuals are certainly important. Under the right circumstances, one person can change the course of history, but individuals are unpredictable. Whole populations, on the other hand, can be a bit more predictable. Given a few basic assumptions about human nature, you can sometimes predict what a whole group will do, even if you don't know the individual players. Today I want to talk about the coronavirus crisis from the highest possible altitude, like aliens approaching from space. So what do these aliens see? I think that right now the aliens would see a planet in shock. Something big is happening and some 8 billion people are trying to figure it out. Everyone is walking around in a daze. They don't know what to make of current events, and they're responding in typical human fashion. They are focusing on trivial things like being absolutely sure they have enough toilet paper, and most people really aren't grasping the big picture. So in this episode, I'm trying to give you that big picture. What's going on in the world today? So the biggest event coming down on us is not this viral epidemic. That's something we can adapt to fairly quickly. The really big event starting to unfold right now is a worldwide economic collapse on the scale of the Great Depression or World War II in Europe. Everyone's life is going to be turned upside down by this. Now, the COVID-19 virus triggered the collapse, but it didn't cause it. An economic bubble has been building up ever since the great financial crisis of 2008, and maybe even long before that. The virus simply pricked the bubble. The bubble was destined to pop sooner or later, and if a virus didn't do it, something else would. The cause of this bubble is relatively easy to understand. In response to the global financial crisis, the U.S. Federal Reserve and other central banks dramatically lowered interest rates. It was supposed to be a temporary fix, but these absurdly low interest rates have remained with us to this day. This cheap money that the Fed sponsored fueled a massive speculative asset bubble, as well as a host of other dysfunctions. Assets like real estate and stocks shot up in price to unsustainable levels. You may have experienced this if you owned a home and saw it go up in value, or if you tried to buy a home and found it unaffordable. What has to happen in this crisis is that all those asset values must come back down to earth. We are beginning to see this now in the stock markets, which have dropped about 30% from their February peak, and we will see it soon in most other assets, including housing prices. Real estate prices haven't crashed yet, but they will. In my view, the carnage has only just begun. In the background of this is an underlying demographic issue. The population in the developed world is no longer growing. This may seem like a good thing from the environmental standpoint, but from an economic standpoint, it's devastating. All of our economic assumptions about the world were based on the late 20th century environment where everything was growing, powered by the growth of the working population, which came mainly out of the post-war baby boom. A growing population of working-age people means a growing economy, while a shrinking population of workers means a shrinking economy. But all of our financial and social expectations are based on the growing population, the thing we experienced at the end of the 20th century. The world isn't ready for a shrinking economy, and adjusting to this change is what the current crisis is all about. A second demographic factor, apart from the soon-to-be shrinking population, is that people from the high birth period, mainly the baby boom, are now getting old. Most of the baby boomers have already turned 60. As people age, They can still remain vibrant, but on the whole, they produce less for society and require more services like healthcare. So we have this huge burden of old people bearing down on us without enough resources to sustain them. Economic growth has gone stagnant, but asset markets continue to party like it was 1999. All of that is coming to an end right now. This is the massive crash that rationalizes all the insanities of the past. So what does this mean for you and me? Well, there's plenty of reason to be afraid. Wherever your income comes from and whatever assets you think you own, they are both at risk. There's a real possibility that you will lose your job, and there's a real possibility that the assets that you thought you had will evaporate. The first thing we're going to see is massive unemployment. This may seem hard to believe at the current moment because, at least in America, you see help wanted signs in almost every store and restaurants. Those signs will be going away soon as those jobs fill up and go away. This hasn't been reported much in the media yet, but widespread unemployment is already beginning to take hold. It has been masked by the current wave of lockdowns and closings, which I talked about in my previous podcast. In response to requests by the government, employees are being sent home for 2 weeks or more. It's supposed to be temporary, but for many it will be permanent. Coronavirus concerns are killing a whole bunch of industries at once. Tourism and sit-down restaurants, spectator sports, conferences, any kind of mass entertainment. People are being sent home from work, supposedly for a hiatus, but this hiatus could stretch out indefinitely because, frankly, no one ever needed those industries to begin with. By the time the virus abates, the economic collapse will be in full swing, and the consumer will remain in bunker mode, spending as little money as possible. There will be no more frivolous spending, which is devastating for an economy built on frivolous spending. A major portion of the products we buy and services we use just aren't necessary and can be eliminated almost instantly in a downturn. No one needs to buy a boat right now, and they won't, which throws the leisure boating industry into the trash can. Certain industries are kind of safe. Fast food, for example, will probably thrive because it's cheap and people still need to eat. People will still need the basics, but the basics can get very basic if you don't have much money and are struggling to make it last, which is the situation most of us are going to be in. In short, nothing that you could count on 2 months ago is secure anymore. You might not have a job, the assets you thought you had could evaporate, the comfortable retirement you planned might never come to pass. Everything might have seemed fine in January, but now everyone's lifestyle, if not their very life, is at risk. So how are people reacting to this? They're doing it in typically human ways. They are overreacting. They are focusing on trivialities like toilet paper. Some are denying that there's anything wrong at all. Many others are hunkering down for the apocalypse, but largely they're preparing for the wrong apocalypse. They are stockpiling supplies they don't need and are declining to prepare for the risks that might really get them. Surprisingly, I'm fairly optimistic about the virus itself. I think it's not going to infect or kill as many people as the early scenarios suggest, at least in the developed world. This is because I think people are taking hygiene and social distancing very seriously. This isn't based on any empirical data, just on my observations of the people around me. They are very focused on this and are truly changing their behavior. They are careful about how they touch door handles. They're avoiding crowds. Social distancing seems to come naturally to Americans because we are a very socially distant people anyway. I think the internet and social media are a great asset to humanity in this because they allow the rapid dissemination of information. Much of the information is crap, but I think most of it is helpful. Even without the government telling them, people know what to do. They are acting as though their life depended on their hygiene plan, which it does. If anything, people are overreacting to the virus, which is par for the course. A virus is a passive particle. It can hang in the air for a few minutes or sit on a surface for up to 3 days, but it can't jump long distances, it can't pass through walls, it can't stalk you through the streets, yet people are acting as though it can. They act as though the virus can do anything and there's no boundaries, so the only thing you can do is climb into your bunker. And you expect other people to do the same. For example, older people seem to be upset that college students are still enjoying spring break down in Florida. There are shots in the news of young people filling the beaches, and the old people say, how outrageous! They're out enjoying themselves when they should be hunkered down inside. Well, I can't think of a safer place to be than a beach right now. There's plenty of air circulation. Even on a crowded beach, nobody touches anyone else. There are no doorknobs or common surfaces that everyone is touching. I think the old people are mainly upset by the image of people relaxing and having fun. This is a national crisis and you're supposed to be miserable. Humans, on the whole, prefer rituals over substance, and right now the main ritual is lockdowns. You're supposed to go inside, hunker down, and not interact in person with anyone else, which doesn't make a lot of epidemiological sense. You don't have to be inside to be safe. If you take a hike in the woods, you are 100% safe. If you meet someone in the street and you don't shake hands, I think it is completely fine to hold a long conversation with them, just as you normally would. There's just some very simple behavior changes here. You don't shake hands, you don't hug or kiss people in social settings, you are careful of the objects you touch in common. These are simple things to learn, and they don't disrupt your life much at all. So right now we're in this period of overcompensation. People are going overboard in their virus protection strategies, which is better than not responding at all. Over time, people will separate out the useful strategies from the ridiculous ones, but it's a long process. It's just like how people in the U.S. reacted to 9/11. Initially, everyone overreacted to the terrorism threat. They saw terrorists everywhere, in places where they couldn't possibly be. But over time, society settled into some fairly reasonable precautions without disrupting people's lives. And that's where things are headed with the coronavirus. People are paranoid and overreacting right now, but eventually sensible precautions will set in and the virus itself will fade into the background. As I said in my previous podcast, I think the massive wave of lockdowns and closings we're now seeing is counterproductive, but it does give people time to regroup. Effectively, Europe and North America are beginning a 2-week forced vacation when people in their governments have a chance to process things, and I think they'll come out with a fairly sane set of strategies, at least regarding the virus. No one will be shaking hands anymore. Big, tight crowds will be a thing of the past, but most of our previous activities will be allowed to resume. Overall, I'm pretty optimistic about the public response to the virus. People will look after their own survival with a personal hygiene plan that is reasonably effective, and this will limit the infection rate. I'm not optimistic, however, about the financial crisis. This is a massive, world-changing event that won't be quickly assimilated. I don't know what's going to happen next. All I know is that debts are unsustainable in all sectors of the economy, and one way or another, these debts must collapse. When people lose their jobs, they stop paying their debts. They stop paying their student loans, their credit cards, their mortgages, because they need that money for food and other basics. When this happens on a massive scale, it means the creditors are going to fail. That means bank failures, pension fund failures. Lots of institutions are going to fail. It will be like bombs dropped on German industry in World War II, except none of the offices or factories will be destroyed. What is being destroyed here is the financial juice that makes them all run. Everyone is going to expect a bailout from the government, and the government will probably comply. Right now, the Trump administration is proposing that a $1,000 check be sent to every taxpayer, and that's just the beginning. Every affected industry is going to want a bailout. Airlines, banking, tourism, And the government will try to do it because the alternative is to see these industries collapse. The trouble is, the government doesn't have any money. For years, it has been spending more money than it makes in taxes, and it's going to get much, much worse. A $1 trillion deficit is going to turn into a $2 or $3 trillion deficit. Before this crisis, last year, the U.S. government was borrowing roughly 25% of its annual budget, and that percentage is going to explode. The only way the government can fund these bailouts is by printing money. The way it works is the government issues bonds, then the Federal Reserve buys those bonds and creates new money. It's a Ponzi scheme, pure and simple, and everything is going to collapse. I can't tell you exactly when and how it will collapse, but it will collapse. So the virus itself is manageable. It's going to be brought under control. I don't think the lockdowns will help, but the hygiene plans of individuals probably will. In a few months, the virus will seem like a routine part of life. It will become normalized. We are a long way from normalization on the financial front. The 30% collapse of stock markets over the past couple of weeks is just the beginning. There's a lot of even worse financial news yet to come. I don't want to predict exactly how that bad news will unfold, but it is coming. In the long run, governments, corporations, and individuals can't pay their huge debts, while much of the wealth we thought that we had will evaporate. Things will be bad in financial markets, but they will also be bad on the ground because people will lose their jobs, and sooner or later the government well will run dry. Even I have trouble getting my head around this whole thing. I know what the end result will be: a massive debt default in which most debts are disabled, most assets are devalued, and the economy has to be restarted almost from scratch. I just don't know how we're going to get there.